Ready when you are.
Yes.
Oh, right. Okay. So, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Beverly Webb. I'm the Lead Standards Development Manager for the Physical Security Portfolio at BSI. We enjoy an excellent level of engagement across the entire security supply chain. And I think that you will agree that this, what follows, is a good example of how our committee responds to an industry need. In this case, we were delighted again to work with one of our key stakeholders, the British Security Industry Association, BSIA, who provided one of their publications for us to use as a base document to build upon during the development of a standard which will provide an ethical framework to a new technology which is rapidly advancing in its application in the everyday lives of us all. So therefore, I'm delighted to introduce, coming a little later, Pauline Nordstrom, CEO of Anacanta Consulting and a member of the BSI committee developing the standard. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing Dave Wilkinson, the Technical Director of BSIA and Chair of the BSI Video Surveillance Systems Committee, leading the development of the standard. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Bev, and welcome to everybody. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so yeah, thanks for the introduction. So as Bev said, BSIA, we're a trade association, so we're made up of members of industry, which puts us in a pretty unique position really to respond to requests like this. And as Bev said, this was very much about sort of creating some guidance and actually moving it further on into the sort of a standardization arena. So just to give a little bit of background from the BSIA's point of view, we obviously have had facial recognition on our radar for quite some time. Sort of this technology is not new to us. We've had AI type technology in our sort of service sector for many years, but facial recognition is a lot more prominent, and I guess as a special category data, biometric technology is obviously getting a lot of airtime and clearly has some benefits and potential privacy issues. So I wanted to start off by maybe citing a little bit about some of the known regulation that we looked into as the BSIA, which then sort of fell out of the idea of we needed to write some guidance, obviously, so industry understands what's needed, and also we could share our sort of knowledge with the wider public. So we are aware that the European Commission has obviously got a draft regulation around artificial intelligence. We contributed to the consultations on that ourselves, and again give us a good knowledge of how they're looking at approaching from more of a risk sort of perspective. We're also aware, obviously, in the United States, they don't have federal law, to my knowledge, at the moment on facial recognition, but they do have state laws. And of course, these are filling the sort of gap at the moment until obviously they get a more federal sort of type law on there. We've also got in the UK, as I'm sure most of you all know, is the UK GDPR, Data Protection Act. And again, there are parts of that which obviously are very applicable to facial recognition. And on the back of that, the enforcing agency for that, being the ICO, actually have issued various guidance on that, which points back to the UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act. So that's sort of the regulation that we brought ourselves up to speed with to then decide whether something was needed in our industry. So one thing that we really picked out from all this bespoke regulation is that there's an issue of ethics here in terms of what's missing. So hence why we actually wrote guidance from the BSIA. This was back in 2021, as Bev's mentioned. I do believe it's actually available in the resources section of this particular session, so you can actually have a look at it. It's freely available there. So again, we use that more as a start point of where obviously we wanted to at least set out the industry's perspective on this. Could you go to the next slide, please? So one of the key things that we said within the BSA is that we really need to bring this into the standards arena. And of course, BSI being the UK standards body, it to us was an absolute right thing to do, that it would then go forward into the arena to develop a standard. And of course, the committee that I actually chair deals with VSS systems and solutions across the UK, and therefore this was a good sort of home for doing this. And what that graphic actually explains on the screen there is different types of standards, whether they be system standards or service or components. And in the middle of that being like the ethical, the nucleus of all this. This is what we deemed as being missing, especially in the topic area that we're talking about for facial recognition. So we are aware standards do exist for systems and components in this particular field, but ethics is missing, and that's why we thought, well, this is needed. So again, because our industry is very much self-regulated, we use standards in a voluntary method, but of course we can use them in schemes or as part of contracts. So I thought it'd be useful to explain just how this sort of is enabled, and therefore we decided ethical standard is required. Can I have the next slide, please? So just a very quick sort of idea of, for those who are not necessarily familiar with how standards are developed, they are actually dealt with through committees, and again, they provide a pretty inclusive and transparent method. And the graphic again is something which BSI kindly provided for me in various sort of previous presentations when we developed standards. So it gives you a bit of a feel of how different users come together to develop the standard. And I think in our case, for facial recognition, we wanted to ensure that this panel would include, for the likes of the police, the actual developers of facial recognition software, the integrators, the designers, human rights groups, and other standards committees, because we're quite knowledgeable that we are not the only organisation that wishes to develop this. So there are other committees within BSI which actually do develop biometric standards. So again, we've got their input as well. So we have a pretty rounded committee of people here that will look to develop this standard. And one thing that I'll highlight, and I'm sure Pauline will probably also mention, is that the standard at the moment that we're developing is still at its early stages. We only started this around about 4 months ago, and it's not due for completion until probably, I think probably just mid-2023. But again, it just goes to show the process that has to be followed. That probably takes me nicely on to the next slide, which is about the process itself. Have the next slide, please. So again, this is just a very quick sort of flow of how things work. So again, we put the committee together, we draft the actual standard itself. It goes out for public consultation, and again, that's another one of the purposes of actually having this discussion today, because delegates on here have an opportunity to raise questions, look for solutions, or offer suggestions of how we can actually make sure we capture every key point within the standard itself. So again, although public consultation is the right point to do it, these types of sessions are great ways for us to actually harness the information that we get from audiences, and of course then we can take this back into our group to actually let them know that this is the type of feedback that we are receiving. So again, this is a little bit of a call to action as well, and clearly if you've got any questions or comments you wish to make, we can clearly take that into account as we carry on developing. And hopefully the committee gains a consensus that we all agree that the standard meets the needs and the objective that was set out, and ultimately it gets published as a British standard. And of course, from there, that then just how it's going to be used. So whether that's going to be used in a contract or a certification scheme, then are the types of questions that get asked. So that's probably a great opportunity for me to sort of hand over to Pauline, who's going to talk a little bit more now about the actual potential content of this standard, which is the important sort of aspect for the ethics. So Pauline, over to yourself.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. So if we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So that was extremely informative. So for my part of the presentation, I'll explain how the standard will be developed. And to reiterate what Dave said, the journey to release will take about 12 to 18 months. But the process of defining what is ethical use of facial recognition software began roughly around the beginning of 2020, and the dialogue was certainly before that. And it was embodied in the guide created by the BSIA. So that's where it all started. And that was the BSIA members and stakeholders that created it. And this provided information, and I'll stress the point, it's information about ethical principles and laws governing facial recognition software at the time it was published in 2021. And it also laid out the foundations of good practice. So the next steps involve moving from the guide in its current form into a more prescriptive structure and working with an extended stakeholder community. And incidentally, I want to make the point that this new standard will be one of the first which defines the ethical use of an AI-based technology in the world. So next slide, please. Thank you. So developing a standard for ethical use does not go without its challenges. And the first for the BSI committee to address is to make a decision about the ethical principles underpinning the standard. But the challenge here is which one, because there are a number. First and foremost, we looked at the OECD AI principles, which focus on how governments and other actors can shape human-centric approaches to trustworthy AI. And these are values-based principles. There are 5, which include sustainability, fairness, transparency, robustness, and accountability. We also looked at the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which sets out state and corporate responsibility to ensure that businesses operate with respect for human rights. And this is an international overarching framework which should lead businesses to stop and think about the impact of AIs, which have the potential to breach privacy in an industrial way and on an international scale without challenge. We also looked at the European Commission high-level expert group, who developed 7 principles underpinning a human-centric approach to AI. I'll describe those a little bit later. The Surveillance Camera Commissioner laid out a code of practice, which was recently updated to include guidelines on the use of facial recognition software by police and local authorities. And what are described as the Beijing AI principles, developed by the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence, set out 6 principles to guide trustworthy AI. So which one should we incorporate, or all of them? But AI has the potential to respect no geographical borders. Therefore, a global and harmonized approach to trustworthy ethical AI should provide reassurance to the public that their rights are respected and that they are informed and aware when they're interacting with an AI-based system, also that they're given a choice not to do so if they wish. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So once we have actually settled on the AI principles underpinning the standard, these have to be codified into the document. And this means creating a structure, definitions of the meanings of terms, and a consistent approach to the application of the principles. And here you see laid out in this slide are the 7 EU guidelines for trustworthy AI, which, reading from left to right, I'll explain what the expert group laid out. So the first being human agency and oversight. And examples of what this means include AI systems should empower human beings, allowing them to make informed decisions and foster their fundamental rights. At the same time, proper oversight mechanisms need to be in place, which can be achieved through human-in-the-loop approaches, very important with facial recognition software. Technical robustness and safety. AI systems need to be resilient and secure. They need to be safe, ensuring a fallback plan in case something goes wrong, as well as being accurate, reliable, and reproducible. Privacy and data governance, another area. Besides ensuring full respect for privacy and data protection, adequate data governance mechanisms must be in place, taking into account the quality and integrity of the data, and ensuring access to data is legitimate, a very important point. Transparency. The data system, AI business models should be transparent, and traceability mechanisms can help achieve this. AI systems and the decisions should be explained in a manner adapted to the stakeholder concerns, and humans need to be aware they're interacting with an AI system, and they must be informed of the system's capabilities and limitations. Looking at diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, another point. Unfair bias must be avoided because it could have multiple negative implications, from the marginalisation of vulnerable groups to the amplification of prejudice and discrimination. And AI systems should be accessible to all, regardless of any disability, and involve relevant stakeholders throughout their entire life cycle. Where the societal environmental well-being is concerned, AI systems should benefit all human beings, including the future generations. And the systems must be sustainable and environmentally friendly. And finally, looking at governance and accountability, mechanisms should be in place to ensure responsibility and accountability for AI systems and their outcomes, auditability, which enables the assessment of algorithms, data and design processes, play a key role in this, especially in critical applications where corrective processes are essential. So there's a lot in there, and these principles provide a great start point for the essential elements of the facial recognition standard, but they do need to be explained in detail and importantly translated from theoretical goals into achievable operational action points for an organisation to follow. And that's our job on the BSI committee to do that. Next slide, please. So the next step, once we finish reviewing the global ethical principles, is to create clear pillars represented in this Parthenon style diagram, which conveniently shows the underpinning principles supported by detailed guidance for each of the stakeholders. So this is very much work in progress, and we're discussing this in the committee right now. The next slide, please. So looking at the stakeholders, who are they? Well, a stakeholder might be a product developer, a system designer, an integrator, or in fact an installer of the technology. And the end user, who is accountable for the evaluation of the impact and the safe and ethical use of the technology, and only if the risks have been mitigated. Each stakeholder group will have a specific set of obligations, and the standard will make it easy to monitor and manage the performance against each. The next slide, please. So the user of the technology is accountable for its ethical and safe use. We see two distinct ways in which and that is firstly to verify the identity of a person, to confirm it's you. Facial recognition software is widely used for this purpose in border control. I'm sure you're familiar with passport control, to manage physical access to buildings, to authenticate mobile banking transactions, and to protect access to devices such as laptops and mobile phones. And here we illustrate the process of image capture, how the technology works, and where the human is in the loop of any questions raised about the validity of a face match. So mobile apps won't let the consumer access them without the Face ID, which is particularly problematic if the facial recognition model is not trained with a diverse data set. This is an area where developers are highly focused to avoid and eliminate bias altogether. No one should be excluded from accessing the technology on the basis of their characteristics. Next slide, please. So the second use case is for identification purposes, and this is probably the most controversial use case, and if deployed without any controls, can be the most harmful to an individual's human rights. Examples of this way of using facial recognition software are police use, which may be for counter-terrorism purposes, also maybe to search for missing people. Shops and stadia are interested in facial recognition to reduce loss and to manage the safety of crowds at sporting events. Private security firms may be required to allow access to those on an agreed list or exclude those which the private building owner may not want to allow onto their premises. And border control officers may need to find a known suspect or lost person in airports and port environments. These are examples of legitimate reasons for deploying the technology, but it must be done ethically, safely, securely, and transparently. In this use case, we also show that a human must be in the loop of the final decision, although privacy groups would like to see a ban altogether. And in Europe, the EU AI Act will prohibit all remote biometric identification, otherwise known as live facial recognition, as it's described in the UK, unless for law enforcement and only in agreed circumstances. The challenge for the BSI committee is to embody safeguards into the standard to enable a company or organisation to deploy facial recognition software in a way which is consistently ethical and also auditable. So next slide, please. So, reflecting on the reasons why a British standard for the ethical use and deployment of facial recognition software in video surveillance applications is needed at all. I know it's a long title. Here are some high-profile cases which have emerged pre-standard. Clearview AI. This is a developer who made an app which matches images taken on a mobile phone against a database of images and names gathered from social media sites around the world. Was this ethical? That is the burning question. Well, the developers thought it was, but the consequences resulting from the global use of the product have been profound. Just this week, the Information Commissioner in the UK fined them £7.5 million, ruling that Clearview AI had breached UK data protection law. And although the images gathered were publicly available to anyone online, the change of use of the images to be incorporated into the Clearview app for identification purposes and the processing of the images to create biometric special category data, also known as sensitive data, breached the law in the UK. There were other infringements, but these were the most substantial. And Clearview AI have been ordered by the ICO to delete all images of UK citizens. And we're watching with interest to see if the appeal, which no doubt there will be an appeal, reveals further clarifications. In other areas, Clearview have taken the approach whereby they seek to know their customer, lessons learned perhaps, the ultimate end user of their product, and have now controlled the access to it unless for very specific purposes, mostly law enforcement, where it's been proven useful. But without controls over its use, it's also been associated with amplification of bias in policing, resulting in a complete ban in some areas of the US. Clearly an unanticipated outcome for Clearview AI. And this raises a question, why would a company set out to do this? But in the absence of an ethical standard, they may not have known how to operationalise ethics and put them into practice, in other words. So other high-profile cases include the South Wales police case brought by Liberty International. This case served to clarify important points, including the need to encourage challenge of the software provider, to provide reassurance about the level of bias in the AI training data model, the equality of the watch list of interesting people, and the requirement to undertake data protection impact assessments when planning to deploy the technology. In the US, facial recognition has been banned in a number of states due to a lack of consistency, training, and control over its use. Also due to a range of qualities of some models which perform poorly with a diverse demographic. One of the states which imposed a ban was North Virginia. However, since, an increasing crime has been observed, resulting in a review of the technology and the guidance available. The prohibition is to be lifted, with restrictions defining its use for specific purposes, such as finding missing people or retrospective search for the suspect in recorded footage. So with AI technology, there are no borders. And in this case, the SIA, the USA equivalent to the BSIA, have been providing guidance to the state to help them mitigate previous issues. Now, this new standard is a British standard, which will be adopted in the UK. But in theory, it could progress to the European community and worldwide in the future. But overall, with the correct controls in place and consistency in the implementation, which can be measured and checked against the standard, there is a high probability that the use of facial recognition software can be used ethically and in all use cases which adhere to the standards. So it's a very important piece of work. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you found it informative. And at this point, I'd like to hand back to Beverly. Thank you very much. Over to you, Bev.
Okay, so we have been getting some questions through, so I will start at the top because it's as good a place as any. And we've been asked, does the standard include photos as well as video? So will it impact Facebook's use of facial recognition on photos posted?
Do you want to take that, Pauline? Or?
Shall I take that? Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, sure.
So the standard is designed to guide those using facial recognition with video surveillance technology. But in theory, it could guide the use by another organisation, though that is not video surveillance.
Okay. So, and also we've got, will facial recognition software be banned in public places in the UK?
I think again that's obviously, I presume, a government decision, but this is the reason why, you know, creating an ethical standard is a good way to sort of at least put out a national standard, which actually will go into your third. I think I can see the question about how the standard will be used, but so I think the answer to that question is the jury's out on it at the moment. I know there was a request for a moratorium some time back in Parliament in terms of potentially getting any sort of use of the technology banned, but of course that hasn't happened. And again, I guess you know, this was one of the reasons why we, the BSAA, wished to act, and obviously the guidance was our first stage to raise the awareness, and of course the standard then becomes the that's a secondary measure that we wanted to do. Is obviously then if we put it into a national standard, then of course it carries more weight. So yeah, I guess I don't think we have an answer to will it be banned. I would certainly hope that you know, there is good recognition of the benefits of what AI and sort of facial recognition does in some of the use cases Pauline's mentioned. And as you say, there's a lot used in sort of the verification sort of perspective as well, where it's more on a one-to-one basis. I think that's how the ICO would sort of view that. So so again, it's it again depends on the usage, and I know the EU have taken a different approach in terms of what they're proposing for high risk facial recognition possibly being banned. So again, we're aware there are different views in different sort of parts of Europe and the UK, so I'm not sure we have an answer to that question directly.
So given the known unknowns, that brings us on to how we ensure the standard will be used.
Well, that's an interesting one, because again, the security sector, video surveillance, in the main is actually voluntary standards. So there's different ways in which standards can be applied. I mean, they can be applied as part of certification schemes, which we're quite used to, and the certification schemes that operate across the UK capture the sort of security market. You know, those who install, those who design. Doesn't necessarily capture manufacturers and developers in that respect, but there are different ways that can also be achieved by using a standard. And of course, schemes are great because obviously they can have third-party certification, so there's somebody regulating that in terms of it's being used correctly, and anything that's wrong would obviously have to be put right. It's also very possible as well through standardization that you know, standards can become designated standards in the UK, that the equivalent of a harmonized standard in the EU, for the same purposes. If government wish to pick up on it and actually use the standard, then of course if they harmonized it, it means it's got a formal mechanism in place that you'd have to follow by law. So again, health and safety exec use certain standards which they obviously employ in law. As you said, in the main, most of ours are voluntary, but I think representing the professional security sector, we do tend to see a good adoption of standards when they're obviously called up in as you say, certification and contract.
Yeah, I think sometimes in the security sector, when something goes wrong, it can go terribly wrong. So
well, it can, and again, don't forget, we've also got the Security Industry Authority, the SIA, that license as well. So who's to say that there is not something through that mechanism, through the ICO, through the Biometric and Surveillance Camera Commission that might come through. So there's a few different mechanisms, but I think, you know, the primary purpose is getting a standard published on ethics, which hopefully could then be used as the base sort of standard, the code of practice across the UK, which is what I think we should achieve.
And so I've got one here asking whether it's legal to use Clearview software in the UK if you're a private individual. I know it was mentioned in Pauline's presentation.
Okay, well, I think we might have lost Pauline.
Yeah, I think we might have.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Still there.
Can you hear me?
Just, yeah.
Yeah, Clearview, according to the ruling, how I interpret it, they shouldn't make it available to people in the UK. But in theory, if they deleted the UK images, then it would be available for people in the UK to use. So it's an interesting question, and I can't say I've got a fully formed answer to that, other than if Clearview follow the ruling, they have to get rid of UK images. But that doesn't stop a UK-based person from using the software. And that's probably a decision for Clearview to make at some point.
Okay, and then I suppose in similar nature, the question of whether you need a license to use facial recognition software. We may have already answered that.
Did you want to pick up on that one, Pauline?
Yeah, you don't need a license to use it, but you do need to be compliant with data protection law. So if you wanted to use it in particular in a way that might impact on the privacy of individuals, you have to perform what's known as a data protection impact assessment. And if you're unable to mitigate the impact on individuals, you have to report that through into the ICO and seek their guidance with regard to that particular use case. So there are some safeguards in place, although no licensing is in place.
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well, I think is one of the things we might have had from previous BSA positions and guidance on this is that this might come as a requirement if legislated in the UK. That it might become a licensable activity in some way, shape, or form. So therefore, in due time, it might do. That would depend on the UK government's appetite to apply that, and obviously who would be the regulator of it, whether it's the ICO, the SIA, or another.
And then we've got one here. What is being done about bias in facial recognition software? There's been a lot of publicity about that.
Shall I pick that one up? So developers are acutely aware of this issue and they are continually improving their data sets. The bias grows as a result of the training model. And with some AIs, they have to be trained to do things. And if you feed them one particular demographic, they'll get very good at recognizing faces from that demographic. If you don't have enough data relating to other characteristics other than that demographic, it's going to fail to properly identify, to map the faces properly. So developers are trying to improve this, and there's an organization in the US called NIST, which provides testing and a kind of scoring system, and it's just getting better and better and better. And the accuracy of some of these models is so good. They're quoting less than 1% failure to properly recognise. So it's a continual body of work. So and the developers never rest on this because they want to make very good, robust software that is used, it's beneficial to society.
Okay, so we've got how do you ensure the right organisations are on the standards development panel? I think that Dave, probably you're the best place for that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, again, as part of, I guess, yeah, in this particular case, we obviously have a formal sort of committee structure within BSI, and obviously the main video surveillance committee actually looks at this in terms of what is needed for this specialist subject area. And what we would normally do, and we did in this case, is that we seek out organisations that are known to be interested, or stakeholders. That usually generates a pretty good return of information, so we know, I think, as I referred to in my earlier slide, the different stakeholders that are naturally there. And of course, what we also find is that when we then sort of form that panel, I know obviously from BSI's point of view, they pull together what's called a business case. So obviously, again, that goes in front of a panel within BSI. That also means there's another opportunity for people to capture any sort of panel composition thing. And again, a great example of how this does work in practice is that when we had our first probably 2 meetings of this particular group, again, we had other people on there saying we haven't got anybody representing a certain sector, or there's a company known that is quite sort of prominent in this particular area. And we've added 2 or 3 groups. One of what we were short in the very first meeting of not having an end user, and I think that's absolutely critical that end users are included in our group, because ultimately they are the ones going to be responsible. They're the ones that are deploying and have to justify to people who come through their shop doors or in the town centre just how they're going to use it. So yeah, we've got a good mix in the group itself, and as you said, it's quite a formal process that we go through, and again, there are checks and balances. It's not just which people would you like in there because you know what they're like. I'm challenged as the chair, obviously by yourself, Bev, and also by your peers as well, in terms of have we considered this, have we considered that, and of course we've got to have a balance. What you cannot have is several developers in there with only 2 other people, so clearly you're going to have an imbalance of what that standard is going to look like. So I do expect challenges in this particular group. It's not going to be an easy standard to write. We've got some really good start points, as Pauline's mentioned, in terms of the ethical pillars, and as you said, there's been an awful lot of publicity around this, which again we're harnessing. We've got information, obviously what the ICO's published, and Pauline's referred to some of the draft regulations and what's been going on. So that's a really good opportunity for us to sort of absorb what the feeling is out there, and obviously what needs to be taken into account. As you said, challenging, but I think exciting at the same time, that we'll have something really tangible out, which hopefully will be a good benefit to all those involved in facial recognition and subject to its being its use as well. So
yeah. And it's an interesting one here. We're being asked if there's a likelihood of facial recognition being used in military drones.
Well, not sure that's going to be in our standard, but
no.
We might military use, all talking at once. So military use sits outside the European Directive for law enforcement. So it is an area that is really down to how the government manages its intelligence services, rather than what we consider to be a use case in this context. It's certainly not in our dialogue currently, but now it's been mentioned. We'll take that into the group and we will discuss it next time we get together.
Yeah, we could reach out to our MOD friends as well. So yes, worth noting that.
That's a good point, Bev. It's another stakeholder that has a view, as you said. So we've obviously also looked for consultation through the Home Office. We can give them their sort of directive and perspective on this. Obviously with the police, as you said, MOD is another opportunity. One thing that it might be worth pointing out that we're doing slightly differently to a normal committee panel on this standards development is that we also have an outer stakeholder group. And that's quite unique. Most committees I've ever worked in, it's a panel of people. They get together, they write the standard, they gain consensus, it gets public comments, as I mentioned on the slide earlier. But this particular one, because of its subject area, has got an external stakeholder group we can call on as well. So that will allow us to then reach out to the ICO, to the Biometric and Surveillance Camera Commissioner, the Home Office, probably DCMS, because they had a recent sort of, was it data and new directive came out. So we've got the opportunity and the contacts to go out to all these organisations and seek their view and understanding and experience of working on the body-worn video standard, which we actually developed some couple of years ago. We went out to the ICO then and we had feedback from them. So they told us what was good, what was bad, what was missing. And that's the whole point of standards development. It's transparent. It gives us the opportunity to reach out without fear of, we're upsetting one person against another one. And I think that's the key message, I think, from this session today, is that, this is it's a well-rehearsed process that we follow here. And of course, for those people that are listening that are thinking, I'm interested in what you guys do but don't know how to go about it, whether it's from me, it's worth getting into. It's a really good area of interest, and it really does put people on the map for, as you say, being recognised for being contributors to standards, as opposed to just being the recipient of having to follow them. So great opportunities for people who want to get involved.
So we don't seem to have any more questions. We've exhausted our questions, unless there's any more that pop up in the next millisecond. But I think that we're coming to the end of our time in probably about 30 seconds as well. So I think that we just need to say thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Dave and Pauline, for dedicating your time to both today and on the panels. It's a hard slog. A lot of us know it who are on this call, and the people that will join later will know it in the future. But it's all fun. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really, really good. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
See you all.